Erik Wasson is certainly looking. Bloomberg congressional reporter hasn't missed a beat up there, and he's back on the Hill today with us now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's like Groundhog Day up there, right, Erik?
Yeah, it looks to be. It looks like the votes will fail again, barring some last-minute surprise. And, we had a story on the terminal today. The White House is signaling if this Monday vote does go down, they're prepared to announce and unleash a round of mass firings. I'm not entirely sure what agencies would be targeted, or even if that's an empty threat. We know from past experience that, layoffs do require a lot of paperwork. Human resources would have had to been working overtime over the weekend to prepare and make sure these are legally bulletproof. But that could be the big development today if there are mass firings. We're also looking to see if moderates are any closer to some kind of off-ramp for Democrats. I talked to a well-placed source earlier today who said that they're trying to entice just enough Democrats, 5 Democrats, to come over and vote for the stopgap bill by saying, look, we'll pass some of these regular appropriations bills. There's what's called a minibus funding the agricultural, Veterans Affairs, and other departments. We could pass that. Maybe pair the defense bill with the labor, health, and human services bill. That has a big increase for the National Institutes of Health. So that Democrats could say, okay, look, we fought Trump's attempts to cut medical research. So far, that's not getting enough traction. Democrats are still saying, look, we have the larger issue of the Obamacare subsidies, and that has to be addressed in some way, not just a vague promise to deal with it later before we can sign on.
Boy, all right. Well, I don't know if we're going to get a layoff announcement here today, but I just wonder about the 2 dates that everyone's looking at, Erik. The 10th is when federal workers start missing a pay cycle. The 15th would be for members of the military. Would those compel a couple of Democrats to cross the aisle and get this done?
I think it's certainly a very motivating factor, and certainly economic terms. We start to see missed paychecks, ramifications to GDP start to pile up. The Trump shutdown in 2019 really ended when air traffic controllers said they're not going to work anymore without pay and started to threaten to close down the skies. At some point, you do have essential workers say, look, this is enough. So that could add some pressure. If we go beyond that, though, both sides may even feel they want to dig in. So I think there's a real feeling. We talked to Mike Rounds, who's one of these moderate Republicans trying to negotiate some kind of near-term deal and also a deal on Obamacare subsidies, saying, look, this drags out. The rhetoric could get even more heated. Let's do something now. So far, that plea is falling on deaf ears, at least here in the Senate.
You mentioned the Obamacare subsidies, which is something we certainly chewed on a lot last week. Erik, whether we get there or not in terms of this continuing resolution, and maybe there's a promise to get an up or down vote on Obamacare subsidies, but what makes us think the government won't just be headed for another shutdown at the end of the year here if we can barely get this done now?
It's certainly a possibility, and I feel like, Republicans are hoping they kind of break Chuck Schumer here. If Chuck Schumer sees a defection of Democrats, and is unable to hold the line, then his, future threats, perhaps in December or even beyond, of not, voting for a spending bill may ring hollow. We're also looking into the possibility that the Senate could change its rules. It's done so for nominees. It could change its rules to say, for example, a stopgap spending bill in the event of a shutdown only requires a simple majority. But there's certainly some experts who believe that would be the end of the legislative filibuster. And Republicans are loath to really go that far, because then we'll see perhaps Democrats come in one day and make D.C. a state, Puerto Rico a state, do other things without the threat of a filibuster holding them up.
Keep hearing about a jailbreak, Erik, right? You got Fetterman, Cortez Masto, King. That means they'd only need a handful more Democrats here. You don't have to have a grand bargain if you can peel off a couple more names, right?
Right, and that's why they're really looking at certain appropriators like Jeanne Shaheen, people who know that buried in these appropriations bills, there are potential victories for Democrats. There is a potential pushback on White House Budget Director Russ Vought, who's wanted to slash all of these federal jobs. If the appropriations process goes forward and passes higher spending levels for agencies like the NIH, like the Department of Education, then you certainly have a case to go to the Supreme Court and say Congress intended these to be fully staffed. In the absence of any bills, certainly the White House is going to see a lot more flexibility and certainly see its court case before the Supreme Court enhanced. So there is that argument in the backdrop, but the ACA issue is so paramount, and a real sense among Democrats that because as we reported, some 70 to 80% of recipients of Obamacare subsidies are in Republican-won states, that the Republicans will come around on that. We're also looking to see where a deal could be. There's some reporting we're trying to confirm that there's a White House proposal to only allow previous enrollees to get the subsidies, sort of capping and ending the program. We'll see if that plays out.